What punishment did your family use that you didn't realize was illegal? The hospital social worker asked if my knees always looked like that, and I glanced down at the thick scar tissue covering both kneecaps before answering that yes, they'd looked like this since I was about 9 years old. She wrote something in her file that made her pen pause midway through, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read before asking very carefully how I'd gotten those scars. I explained that they were from correction posture, something my family did when we needed discipline, and I'd spent so many hours kneeling on concrete or tile over the years that the skin had just built up like that. The social worker, whose badge identified her as Monica Albright, MSW, set down her pen and asked me to explain exactly what correction posture meant. I was sitting in the emergency room at St. Vincent's Hospital because I'd passed out during my shift at the restaurant where I worked, and apparently my boss had been concerned enough about my pallor and the fact that I'd been unable to stand up properly that he'd called an ambulance. I was 22 years old, living on my own for the first time after moving out of my parents' house 6 months earlier, and I'd thought the fainting was just from not eating enough because money was tight. But Monica had been called in after the ER doctor had noticed some things during my examination that had concerned her. I'd grown up in what seemed like a normal suburban family in Northern Virginia. My father, David Brennan, was a successful real estate attorney who specialized in commercial property disputes. My mother, Carol Brennan, was a stay-at-home mom who volunteered extensively with our church and ran what she called a tight ship at home. I had 2 younger siblings, my brother Isaac, who was 19 and still living at home while attending community college, and my sister Lily, who was 16 and in high school. From the outside, we probably looked like an ideal family. Well-maintained house in a good neighborhood, active in church, kids who were polite and well-behaved, parents who were involved in the community. What people didn't see was the correction system my parents had implemented when I was 7 years old, after my father had attended some kind of intensive Christian parenting seminar that had convinced him traditional American discipline was too permissive and children needed stronger consequences to truly learn obedience and respect. The correction system had 3 main components: correction posture, correction time, and correction assembly. Correction posture meant kneeling on a hard surface, usually the tile kitchen floor or the concrete garage floor, with your back straight, hands folded, and eyes downcast for a period determined by the severity of your infraction. Minor offenses like talking back or forgetting chores meant 30 minutes. Moderate offenses like lying or poor grades meant 2 to 3 hours. Major offenses like defiance or disrespect could mean 6 hours or more, sometimes spread across multiple days. Correction time was isolation in what my parents called the reflection room, which was actually a converted storage closet under the stairs that had been emptied except for a wooden stool and a Bible. You'd sit in there in the dark, with the door locked from the outside, for periods ranging from 1 hour to an entire day depending on what you'd done wrong. And correction assembly was the worst part, where the whole family would gather and the child being disciplined would have to stand in front of everyone and confess their wrongdoing, explain why it was wrong, and thank our parents for caring enough to correct us. If your confession wasn't sincere enough, the correction would be extended or intensified. I'd been participating in this system since I was 7, and my siblings had been brought into it as they reached age 6, which my parents considered the age of accountability. For 15 years, I'd believed this was just strict parenting, maybe more intense than some families, but not fundamentally different from the discipline methods other Christian families used. I'd never told friends about the specific details because my parents had explained that outsiders wouldn't understand our family's commitment to biblical discipline, that people in the modern world had grown too soft and would judge us for taking child rearing seriously. So I'd kept quiet about the hours spent kneeling until my knees ached and then went numb, about the times I'd wet myself during correction posture because I wasn't allowed to move or speak to ask for bathroom breaks, about the panic attacks I'd had locked in the reflection room in the dark, about the humiliation of correction assemblies where I'd had to publicly confess to things like having proud thoughts or selfish attitudes. Monica was staring at me with an expression that was becoming increasingly alarmed as I explained all this, and when I finished describing a typical correction posture session, she asked how long the longest one had been. I thought back and said probably around 9 hours when I was 14, after I'd gotten caught talking to a boy from school that my parents hadn't approved of. I'd knelt in the garage from right after school until bedtime, with breaks only when my father came to check if I'd reflected sufficiently on my disobedience. My knees had bled that time, the skin splitting open from the pressure and duration, and I'd had trouble walking normally for a week afterward. Monica's hands were shaking slightly as she wrote more notes, and she asked if my siblings were still living at home and still experiencing these correction methods. I said yes, that Isaac and Lily were both still subject to the same discipline system, though Isaac's corrections had become less frequent as he'd learned better compliance and self-control. Lily had apparently been having some trouble lately, though, according to what my mother had mentioned on the phone last week, something about her being defiant and needing more intensive correction to break her willful spirit. Monica excused herself and said she needed to speak with the doctor, and I sat in the examination room feeling confused about why this hospital visit had turned into an extended conversation about my childhood discipline, instead of just treating whatever had made me faint. The ER doctor came back with Monica and a man who introduced himself as Dr. Felix Okafor, a pediatric specialist who also consulted on child welfare cases. Dr. Okafor asked if he could examine my knees more closely, and I agreed, not understanding why this was relevant but figuring hospital procedures were just thorough. He photographed my knees from multiple angles, documenting the thick scar tissue, the areas where the skin texture was permanently changed, and what he described as evidence of repeated trauma to the joint area. Then he asked about other injuries I might have sustained during correction sessions over the years. I told him about the times I'd gotten so dehydrated from not being allowed water during long correction posture sessions that I'd gotten severe headaches and once had what I now realized was probably a mild heat stroke. About the back pain I'd developed from being required to maintain perfect rigid posture for hours at a time. About the panic disorder I'd been dealing with since I was 12, which I'd thought was just my personal weakness but which seemed to get triggered by small enclosed spaces and darkness. Dr. Okafor and Monica exchanged looks that I was beginning to recognize as concern mixed with something else, maybe anger or horror, though I couldn't understand why my family's discipline methods would provoke that response. Dr. Okafor sat down across from me and explained in very clear terms that what I'd described wasn't legal discipline or biblical correction, but systematic child abuse that constituted torture and false imprisonment. The word torture hit me like a physical blow. I insisted that my parents loved us, that they'd always framed correction as something they did because they cared about our character development and spiritual growth, that it had hurt them more than it hurt us to have to implement these consequences. Monica gently pointed out that if it had hurt them so much, they could have stopped doing it, but they'd continued for 15 years and were apparently still doing it to my siblings. Dr. Okafor pulled up information on his tablet about legal definitions of child abuse and read them aloud. Forcing a child to maintain painful positions for extended periods constitutes physical abuse. Confining a child in a small dark space constitutes false imprisonment. Deliberately withholding food or water during punishment constitutes neglect, and inflicting psychological harm through humiliation and isolation constitutes emotional abuse. Every single component of my family's correction system was not just harsh parenting, but criminal behavior. I felt my hands starting to shake as this information processed, as 15 years of believing I deserved those corrections because I'd been disobedient or disrespectful started to crack apart. Monica asked if I'd be willing to file a report with Child Protective Services about my siblings who were still living at home and still being subjected to this treatment, and I realized with cold clarity that Lily was 16 and still enduring what I'd endured, maybe worse given that my mother had said she needed more intensive correction lately. I asked what would happen if I reported this, if my parents would find out it was me who'd told, if my siblings would be taken away from home. Monica explained that CPS would investigate, that they'd prioritize my siblings' safety, and yes, my parents would eventually know that someone had reported them, though the initial report could remain confidential. I thought about Lily, who'd called me crying 2 months ago and said she'd spent 6 hours in correction posture and could barely walk afterward. I told her what my parents had always told me, that the pain was temporary, but the lesson was permanent, that she needed to submit to their authority, and the correction would become less frequent. I'd given her the same justifications I'd been fed for 15 years, had helped perpetuate the system by normalizing it for her. The guilt hit me so hard I felt nauseous. I told Monica I'd file the report, and she brought in a CPS investigator named Tamara Washington, who'd apparently been on call and had come to the hospital within 30 minutes of being contacted. Tamara had worked in Child Protective Services for 11 years and specialized in cases of religious abuse and extreme discipline. She took my statement for 2 hours, asking detailed questions about specific incidents, frequencies, my parents' justifications, whether they'd ever acknowledged that what they were doing might be illegal. I described everything I could remember. The time I'd been in the reflection room for 8 hours and had beaten on the door begging to be let out, and my father had simply increased the time as punishment for my lack of self-control. The time Isaac had collapsed during correction posture, and my mother had made him continue anyway because she said he was being dramatic and manipulative. The correction assembly where Lily had been made to confess to vanity because she'd wanted to wear makeup like her friends, and had been required to cut her own hair short as an additional consequence for caring more about worldly appearance than godly character. Tamara's expression remained professionally neutral, but her jaw was tight as she wrote everything down, and she asked if my parents had documented any of this, or if there was evidence in the house. I told her my father kept detailed correction logs in his home office, recording each child's infractions, the correction implemented, and his assessment of whether we'd achieved genuine repentance and attitude change. He'd explained it as important documentation for tracking our character development over time, proof that he was taking his parenting responsibilities seriously. Tamara said those logs would be crucial evidence, and she was going to request a warrant to search the house and remove my siblings to safety while the investigation proceeded. She asked if I'd be willing to testify if this went to trial, if I'd be willing to face my parents and describe what they'd done. I thought about the fact that I'd moved out 6 months ago and had been so conditioned to believe I deserved the corrections that I'd actually felt guilty for leaving, like I was abandoning my spiritual growth by removing myself from their authority. The realization that I'd been programmed to feel guilty for escaping abuse made something in me snap from shame into anger. I told Tamara yes, I'd testify. I'd do whatever was necessary to protect Isaac and Lily from experiencing what I'd experienced. She made phone calls right there from the hospital, coordinating with local police to execute a welfare check and evidence seizure at my parents' house. She warned me that my parents would likely contact me once they realized what was happening, that they'd try to convince me I'd misunderstood or overreacted, that they'd use guilt and religious obligation to make me recant. She gave me her direct number and told me not to speak to my parents without legal representation present. Within 3 hours, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was shaking with what sounded like rage mixed with fear, and she demanded to know if I'd sent police to their house, if I'd told lies about their parenting to strangers who didn't understand godly discipline. I said I'd told the truth about the correction system, and there was a long silence before my father's voice came on the line, cold and controlled in a way that made my stomach clench with old fear responses. He said I'd betrayed the family, violated the biblical command to honor my parents, and brought shame and worldly interference into a private family matter. He said if I proceeded with this false accusation, I'd be responsible for destroying our family and damaging my siblings' spiritual development by removing them from godly authority. I felt 15 years of conditioning trying to pull me back into compliance, the instinct to apologize and submit and beg forgiveness. But I looked down at my knees with their thick scar tissue, felt the chronic back pain that flared up whenever I stood for too long, remembered the panic attacks and the isolation and the humiliation, and said that they'd destroyed this family themselves by torturing their children and calling it love. My father said I'd regret this decision, that I'd face consequences both earthly and eternal for my disobedience, and he hung up. I sat in the hospital room shaking, and Monica came back with discharge papers and information about trauma therapists who specialized in religious abuse recovery. She told me I'd done the right thing, that reporting took courage, especially when I'd been programmed to protect my abusers, but I didn't feel courageous. I felt terrified and guilty and uncertain whether I'd just helped my siblings or destroyed them. The police had executed the search warrant while I was still at the hospital, and Tamara called me that evening to update me on what they'd found. My father's correction logs filled 3 large binders, documenting 15 years of abuse in meticulous detail. Each entry included the date, the child's name, the infraction, the correction implemented, the duration, and notes on the child's response and attitude. The logs read like a clinical documentation of systematic torture, describing children's pain and distress in detached language, while justifying each punishment as necessary spiritual discipline. The police had also found the reflection room still set up with its door lock, the wooden stool, and nothing else except biblical passages taped to the walls about the importance of submission and obedience. They'd photographed the garage floor where we'd knelt for corrections, the tile kitchen floor with permanent slight discoloration in one area from years of children kneeling in the same spot, and the living room where correction assemblies had been held. Isaac and Lily had been removed from the home and placed in emergency foster care with a family trained to handle children from abusive situations. Tamara said she'd spoken briefly with both of them, and their reactions had been complicated. Isaac had been mostly silent and shut down, apparently so conditioned to compliance that he couldn't process what was happening. Lily had been initially resistant, insisting their parents were good people who'd only disciplined them because they loved them and wanted them to grow into righteous adults. But when Tamara had asked her directly if she wanted to go back to kneeling for hours or being locked in the dark room, Lily had started crying and said no, she didn't want that, but she also didn't understand why it was wrong if it was what the Bible commanded. That confusion, the inability to reconcile abuse with love because they'd been programmed to believe the abuse was the love, was something I understood deeply. I'd spent 6 months living on my own, and I'd still been structuring my life around avoiding correction, still flinching at perceived failures, still expecting punishment for normal mistakes. It took Tamara's explanation and Dr. Okafor's documentation and Monica's horror for me to even begin questioning whether what I'd experienced was wrong. And even now, part of me kept waiting for my parents to explain how I'd misunderstood, how this was all a terrible mistake that could be resolved if I just submitted properly. I'd called the foster family where Isaac and Lily were staying, and the foster mother, Kendra Jacobs, had been kind but firm when she explained that my siblings needed time to adjust before having contact with family members, even me. She said Lily had asked when she'd be allowed to complete her correction for whatever infraction had caused the situation, and Kendra had gently explained that there would be no more corrections, that she was safe now, and mistakes wouldn't result in punishment. Lily had apparently looked at her with complete confusion, and asked how she was supposed to learn right from wrong without correction, how she was supposed to develop character without consequences. Kendra, who'd fostered 12 children from abusive homes over 8 years, told me that deprogramming took time and consistency, that my siblings would need to relearn what normal discipline looked like, what healthy boundaries were, what love without pain felt like. She asked about my own recovery process, and I admitted I hadn't really started one, that I'd just been trying to survive and hadn't recognized I needed recovery from my childhood. The investigation moved quickly once the evidence was secured. My parents were arrested within 48 hours on multiple counts of child abuse, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. Each count represented specific incidents documented in my father's meticulous logs, or corroborated by physical evidence like the modified closet and the marks on my siblings' knees. The arrest made local news because my father was a prominent attorney, and my mother was well known in church and volunteer circles, and the cognitive dissonance of successful, religious, seemingly upstanding citizens being charged with systematic child torture created media interest. I watched the news coverage from my tiny apartment, seeing my parents led out of their house in handcuffs while reporters asked questions about the allegations and whether their church had known about their discipline methods. The church released a statement saying they were shocked and horrified by the accusations, that the Brennan family's private discipline practices had not been known to church leadership and did not reflect the church's teachings on appropriate correction. But within days, 3 other families from the same church came forward saying they'd also implemented similar correction systems after attending the same parenting seminar my father had attended, and CPS launched investigations into those families as well. Apparently, the seminar, which had been run by a traveling ministry organization, had taught that modern American parenting was too permissive and children needed intensive correction, including extended physical discomfort and isolation to break their willful spirits and develop godly character. The organization's materials had skirted just barely on the legal side of advocating child abuse by using vague language about firm discipline and biblical correction, but the practical implementation by families who'd attended had crossed clearly into criminal territory. My parents' attorney, a defense lawyer named Russell Crane, who specialized in religious freedom cases, tried to argue that their parenting methods were protected by constitutional rights to raise children according to religious beliefs. The prosecutor, Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Jennifer Yang, countered that religious freedom doesn't extend to torturing children, that no sincere religious belief justifies forcing a child to kneel on concrete until they bleed or locking them in a dark closet for hours. The preliminary hearing was held 3 weeks after the arrest, and I attended with Tamara and a victim's advocate assigned to help me through the legal process. My parents looked smaller in the courtroom than they'd ever looked at home. My father's confident attorney demeanor reduced to something defensive and brittle. My mother's church lady composure replaced with tears and whispered prayers. Their lawyer presented character witnesses from the church and my father's law firm, people testifying about what good parents they'd seemed to be, how well-behaved and polite their children had always appeared, how devoted the family had seemed. Jennifer Yang then presented Dr. Okafor's medical documentation of the permanent damage to my knees, photographs of the reflection room and correction locations, and excerpts from my father's own logs describing specific abuse incidents in his own handwriting. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Holloway who'd been on the bench for 23 years, reviewed the evidence and ruled there was sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial. She denied bail, calling my parents a potential danger to children and a flight risk given the severity of the charges. I was required to testify at the grand jury hearing, describing specific correction incidents in detail to help the prosecution build their case. The grand jury room felt airless and small, and I had to keep pausing to breathe properly as I recounted things I'd spent years trying not to think about too closely. The time when I was 10 and had been in correction posture so long that I'd lost feeling in my legs and had fallen when trying to stand, and my father had accused me of being dramatic and made me continue kneeling. The time when I was 13 and had been locked in the reflection room overnight as punishment for staying out 30 minutes past curfew, and I'd had a severe panic attack in the dark that had left me hyperventilating and dizzy. But when my parents let me out in the morning, they'd said my distress proved I hadn't truly repented yet. The correction assembly when I was 15, where I'd had to confess to having impure thoughts about a boy, and my mother had required me to describe the thoughts in detail in front of my younger siblings as a humiliation tactic to discourage future lustful thinking. The grand jury foreman, a middle-aged man who'd looked increasingly disturbed as I testified, asked if my parents had ever shown remorse or questioned whether their methods might be too harsh. I said no, that they'd always been completely confident in their approach, had framed any resistance or distress from us as evidence that we needed more intensive correction to break our prideful, rebellious natures. The grand jury returned indictments on all charges within 2 hours. The trial was scheduled for 6 months out, which meant 6 months of my life in limbo, waiting to testify against my parents while trying to process what had happened and figure out who I was without the correction system defining my worth and behavior. I started therapy with a psychologist named Dr. Nina Rashad, who specialized in religious trauma syndrome and child abuse recovery. Our first session, she asked me to describe what I thought love looked like, and I realized I'd been conditioned to associate love with pain, correction with care, and control with protection. Dr. Rashad explained that real love doesn't require suffering to prove itself, that healthy parents provide correction through teaching and natural consequences, rather than through inflicting physical and psychological pain. She said I'd been programmed with what she called a trauma bond to my parents, where the same people who hurt me were also the only ones who could provide relief from that hurt, creating a psychological dependency that made abuse feel like care. We started working on identifying my own feelings and needs separate from the correction system, recognizing that my chronic anxiety and hypervigilance were trauma responses rather than personal failings, understanding that I had the right to make mistakes without expecting torture as a consequence. The work was exhausting and often felt more painful than just accepting the old programming, but slowly I began to separate my parents' version of love from what love actually meant. Isaac and Lily were both in therapy as well, working with counselors who specialized in helping children transition out of abusive environments. Kendra Jacobs gave me updates periodically, explaining that Isaac was struggling with profound depression as the reality of what had been done to him sank in, that he'd spent so many years in perfect compliance mode that he didn't know how to exist without external control. Lily was oscillating between anger at our parents and desperate longing to go home, convinced that if she could just be good enough, submit properly enough, the abuse would stop and she'd get her family back. Kendra was patiently explaining that the abuse had never been about them being bad, that no level of good behavior would have prevented it because the abuse had been about our parents' need for control rather than about our children's actual behavior. I was allowed to start having supervised visits with my siblings 3 months into their foster placement, and the first visit was awkward and painful. Isaac barely made eye contact, answering my questions in monosyllables, clearly shut down and unreachable. Lily was more communicative, but her words were laced with confusion and guilt, asking if I thought they'd sinned by telling people about the corrections, if we dishonored our parents irreparably, if there was a way to fix this so they could go home. I tried to explain what I was learning in therapy, that what had been done to us was wrong regardless of biblical justifications, that our parents had distorted religious teachings to excuse abuse. Lily looked at me with tears running down her face and said she didn't know what to believe anymore, that everything she'd thought was true about family and faith and obedience had been revealed as a lie, and she felt like she was floating in space with nothing to hold on to. The trial began in March, 8 months after my hospital visit had started this cascade. The prosecution's strategy was to let my parents' own documentation convict them, using the correction logs to show premeditation, pattern, and deliberate infliction of harm. Jennifer Yang presented the logs as exhibits, reading selected entries aloud to the jury. April 15th, Simone, age 9. Infraction, spoke disrespectfully to mother. Correction, 3 hours kneeling posture in garage. Child cried extensively and begged to stop after 90 minutes. I explained that her distress proved she hadn't yet achieved genuine repentance. Extended correction to 4 hours. Outcome, appropriate submission achieved. The jury's faces shifted from neutral to disturbed as Jennifer read entry after entry spanning 15 years, showing a pattern of systematic torture justified with religious language. The prosecution called Dr. Okafor as an expert witness to explain the permanent physical damage visible on my knees, the developmental impact of chronic stress and pain on children's growing bodies, the psychological harm caused by extended isolation and humiliation. They called Dr. Rashad to explain trauma bonding and religious abuse, how abusers could convince children that torture was love by framing it within religious authority. And they called me as a victim witness to describe the lived experience of growing up under this system, to explain how I'd been conditioned to believe I deserved the abuse, to show the jury what the clinical language in the logs had actually meant in terms of a child's suffering. Testifying was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The defense attorney, Russell Crane, tried to make me admit that I'd been a difficult, disobedient child who'd required firm discipline, that my parents had only been trying to raise me according to their sincerely held religious beliefs. I refused to play into that narrative, explaining that even when I'd been perfectly obedient and compliant, corrections had continued because the system wasn't about my behavior, but about my parents' need for control and their distorted belief that suffering built character. Russell asked if I loved my parents, clearly trying to imply that if I did, I wouldn't be testifying against them. I said I probably did love them in some complicated trauma-bonded way, but that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their abuse or allowing them to continue abusing others. He asked if I'd felt like I was being tortured at the time, or if that interpretation had only come after being influenced by CPS and therapists. I looked directly at the jury and said that I'd wet myself during correction postures because I wasn't allowed to ask for bathroom breaks, that I'd beaten bloody fists against the reflection room door begging to be let out, that I'd cried myself to sleep with aching knees and back pain so many times I'd lost count. I said that whether or not I'd had the vocabulary to call it torture at the time, the experience had been torturous, and learning the appropriate terms hadn't created the trauma, it had only helped me name what I'd always felt. Isaac testified next, and watching my quiet, compliant brother describe his experiences broke something in me. He spoke in a flat, emotionless tone about the time he'd been 9 and had been in correction posture so long he'd vomited from pain and dehydration, and our father had made him clean up the vomit and then continue the correction. About the time he'd been locked in the reflection room for 6 hours and had developed such severe claustrophobia that he'd clawed at the door until his fingernails bled. About the correction assemblies where he'd been required to confess to thought crimes and attitude problems he hadn't even been aware of until our parents assigned them to him. Russell Crane tried to suggest Isaac was testifying under pressure from CPS or from me, but Isaac looked at the defense attorney with dead eyes and said no one had pressured him, that he was testifying because the truth was that he'd spent his entire childhood in fear and pain, and he'd learned to call that love because that was what he'd been taught. Lily's testimony was more emotional, describing recent corrections from just months before being removed from the home. She talked about spending 6 hours kneeling on the garage floor until her knees bled, about being locked in the reflection room overnight and having a panic attack so severe she'd thought she was dying, about correction assemblies where she'd been humiliated in front of the family for normal teenage behaviors like wanting privacy or expressing opinions. She looked at our parents sitting at the defense table and said she'd wanted so badly to be good enough for them, to earn their approval and avoid correction, but she'd finally realized that was impossible because the system was designed to find fault regardless of how well she performed. The defense's strategy was to present our parents as sincere, devout people who'd been following religious teachings and had never intended harm. They called witnesses from the parenting seminar organization who testified that the program had taught biblical discipline principles, not abuse. Jennifer Yang destroyed that defense by presenting the organization's materials, which included recommendations for extended physical discomfort as correction, isolation in dark spaces to encourage reflection, and public confession of sins to develop humility. She asked the seminar leader, a man named Thomas Whitfield who'd run these programs for 12 years, whether he'd ever considered that his teachings might lead parents to torture their children. Thomas insisted the program had always included caveats about not causing injury or lasting harm, but Jennifer produced testimonials from 6 different families across 3 states who'd all implemented similar abuse patterns after attending his seminars. The prosecution presented evidence that Thomas's organization had been sued twice before by families whose children had been removed for abuse, and that he'd simply moved operations to different states rather than modifying his curriculum. By the end of the trial, it was clear Thomas Whitfield had been running a child abuse training program disguised as religious education, and several jurors looked like they wanted to add him as a defendant. My parents took the stand in their own defense, and watching them testify was surreal. My father maintained that everything he'd done had been motivated by love and a desire to raise godly children in an ungodly world, that the corrections had been carefully considered and appropriately calibrated to teach important lessons. Jennifer Yang asked him if he'd ever questioned whether forcing his 9-year-old daughter to kneel until she vomited was appropriate, and my father said that discomfort was sometimes necessary for growth, that modern parenting had become too soft, and children needed to learn perseverance through difficulty. Jennifer asked if he'd ever considered that his children's fear of him might be a warning sign rather than proof of effective discipline, and my father said that healthy fear of authority was biblical and necessary. She asked if he felt any remorse for the permanent physical damage visible on his children's knees, and my father said that physical marks were unfortunate but secondary to character development. The jury's expressions shifted from disturbed to disgusted as my father essentially admitted to everything while justifying it as good parenting. My mother's testimony was similar but more emotional, crying as she insisted she'd only wanted to protect us from worldly corruption, that she'd believed the corrections were showing us love by holding us to high spiritual standards. Jennifer asked her if she'd ever wondered why her children had panic attacks and chronic pain, and my mother said she'd thought those were spiritual attacks from Satan trying to undermine their family's commitment to godliness. Jennifer asked if it had ever occurred to her that the Satan attacking her children had actually been her and her husband, and my mother broke down crying while insisting they'd only ever tried to do right by us. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. My parents were convicted of 3 counts of child abuse for each child, 9 counts of false imprisonment, and 9 counts of child endangerment, representing the most severe documented incidents from the correction logs. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later, and the judge allowed victim impact statements. I stood before Judge Holloway and described what growing up under systematic torture had done to me, how I still couldn't make mistakes without expecting pain, how I couldn't be in small dark spaces without panic attacks, how I'd spent years believing I was fundamentally bad and deserved suffering. Isaac's statement was shorter but devastating, explaining that he'd lost 15 years of childhood to fear and pain, that he didn't know who he was outside of the correction system, that he was learning at age 19 what healthy family relationships looked like, and grieving the childhood he'd never had. Lily's statement was angry and raw, detailing the recent escalation of corrections she'd endured, the psychological manipulation of being told abuse was love, the betrayal of learning that parents who claimed to cherish her had actually been torturing her. Judge Holloway listened to all 3 statements, then delivered a sentencing statement that validated everything we'd experienced. She said my parents had taken sacred trust of parenting and perverted it into systematic torture, that they'd used religious language to justify cruelty and called it love, that they'd documented their own crimes while congratulating themselves on superior parenting. She said the permanent physical and psychological damage they'd inflicted on 3 children was unconscionable, and that no religious belief system genuinely taught that children should be tortured into submission. She sentenced my father to 20 years in prison with possibility of parole after 12, citing his role as the architect and enforcer of the correction system. She sentenced my mother to 15 years with possibility of parole after 10, acknowledging her participation but slightly lesser role. She also ordered them to pay restitution covering medical treatment, therapy costs, and damages to all 3 children. The courtroom erupted in murmurs when the sentences were announced, and I saw my mother collapse into sobs while my father sat rigid and furious. As they were let out, my father looked at me with an expression of absolute rage and mouthed words I couldn't hear, but understood meant he blamed me for this outcome and would never forgive my betrayal. I felt a moment of the old fear response, the conditioning that told me his anger meant I'd done something wrong and would face consequences. But then I looked at my knees with their permanent scars, felt Isaac standing beside me and Lily holding my hand, and realized that the only consequence I was facing was freedom from ever being hurt by him again. The aftermath was complex and messy and ongoing. Thomas Whitfield's parenting seminar organization was shut down after multiple states launched investigations, and he eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit child abuse in exchange for a reduced sentence. 6 other families from our church were investigated, with 3 losing custody of their children due to similar correction systems. The church underwent leadership changes and implemented mandatory reporting training, though many families left to find congregations that wouldn't question their discipline methods. Isaac struggled with severe depression for 2 years before finding a therapist and medication combination that helped, and he eventually enrolled in college studying social work with a focus on religious abuse recovery. Lily spent 3 years in foster care before aging into independent living, and she cut off all contact with our parents, refusing their letters from prison and declining to attend their eventual parole hearings. I continued therapy for 5 years, slowly unlearning the programming that had defined my childhood, learning to make decisions based on my own values rather than fear of correction, building relationships that weren't based on performance and submission. The chronic pain from my damaged knees remained, a permanent reminder of what had been done to me, but I learned to view the scars as evidence of survival, rather than proof of deserved punishment. 10 years after that hospital visit, I was working as an advocate for children in abusive situations, using my experience to identify signs of religious abuse that other investigators might miss. I'd helped train CPS workers on recognizing systematic discipline that crossed into torture, on understanding how religious language could camouflage abuse, on supporting children who'd been programmed to defend their abusers. Isaac had joined me in this work, and together we'd created a support network for survivors of religious discipline abuse, providing resources and community for people who were recovering from similar childhoods. Lily had become a journalist focusing on investigating extreme parenting movements and religious organizations that promoted abusive practices, exposing the Thomas Whitfields of the world before they could train another generation of parents to torture their children. The three of us had survived our childhood and transformed our trauma into purpose, though we'd never fully recovered the people we might have been without the corrections. Our parents remained in prison, writing letters occasionally that combined apologies with justifications, insisting they'd done their best with sincere beliefs. We didn't respond. They'd taught us about consequences, and now they were experiencing the real-world consequences of their choices. The punishment I didn't realize was illegal had shaped 15 years of my life, but it wouldn't define the rest of it. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.